Vestbredden live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the West Bank Live with Vilde,
Pernille.
And Magnhild.
And Benzi.
Yes, Vilde, Magnhild, and I, we met as accompagners in the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. It's a program organized by the World Council of Churches, and the Norwegian Church Aid is the Norwegian coordinator. And our views in this event are personal. So we spent 3 months in the West Bank earlier this year, placed in Tulkarem, Kalkilia, Bethlehem, and Jericho, where we gained valuable experiences that we want to share with you, and also put available information about what's happening in the West Bank today. So that's why we made this live stream series, West Bank Live. And today we have a guest with us.
Benzi is from an organization called Breaking the Silence. It's an organization of veteran soldiers, and Benzi will introduce it further, so I won't say a lot more about it. I just mention that ever since we arrived to the West Bank, I always heard a lot of good things about the work of the organization Breaking the Silence, and I always wanted to go on one of their tours. Unfortunately, I never had the chance, but therefore I personally am also extra happy therefore that we have Benzi with us today. So yeah, I think I'll just hand it over to you, Benzi. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. So my name's Benzion Sanders. I'm originally from New York. I've been living in Israel for the past 10 years. And I served in the IDF between the years 2012 and 2015 in a unit called Palsar Nahal, or Sayeret Nahal, which is a special forces reconnaissance company. And I first came to Israel. I graduated high school in a modern Orthodox Jewish school and in New York, and I came basically with my entire graduating class to study religious in a religious seminary, a yeshiva, for a year before coming back to college. But things didn't really work out as planned, and it was my first time in Israel, and I fell in love with the country and with the people and with really everything that was happening. I was studying. I was becoming much more connected to my religious identity, my Judaism. I began to really deeply appreciate the historical significance of Israel, of the land of Israel, of the creation of the state of Israel for the Jewish people after 2,000 years of exile. I felt I had this tremendous privilege to live in Israel and be part of it. And I knew that after a few months that I wanted to make Aliyah, to immigrate to Israel and to take on Israeli citizenship and be part of this extremely significant country. I knew that really Israel it was able to exist for as long as it did for, at that time, it was 63 years. Now it's closing close to 73 years. It was 10 years ago. But I knew that Israel only was able to thrive and exist because we had a strong army. The IDF protected Israel from enemies surrounding it, which fought against it in many wars. And I knew more recently there weren't so many big wars, but there were terrorists. They were blowing up buses and killing thousands of Israelis over the years. And so I knew that I had to serve in the IDF, in the army, to protect Israel. And that was something that I was excited to have the privilege to do. I was very active in high school. I was on the wrestling team. I was in the scouts. So I was very outdoors. I was very physical. So I saw myself as if I'm going to be joining the army, then I should try to go into elite combat unit. So after a few more years of studying in yeshiva, I joined the army. I'd taken Israeli citizenship and I was drafted into the IDF. as a citizen. I went into the Nachal Infantry Brigade. I tried out for the Special Forces during the the first week of you get to the basic training base. You try out for the Special Forces, and I was accepted, and I was thrilled. I got into the Special Forces unit, and I started a 14-month-long training. It was very long, intense training. Twice as long as the normal infantry training. Involved a lot of advanced navigation, learning how to go behind enemy lines undetected, to direct artillery fire at them, and really training for war. And after my training, after 14 months of training, we were sent on our first deployment. We were sent to the West Bank, the Shomron, in Hebrew, the northern West Bank, around the city called Nablus. Here's a picture of me. This is right in the first few months after I finished my training. Right, I had arrived in the Shomron, in the northern West Bank. I'm on the top of a mountain called Har Eval, which is actually a famous mountain from the Bible. It's opposite Mount Gerizim. It is the mountain of curse and the mountain of blessing. And in between the two mountains is the city of Nablus, or Shechem in Hebrew. So obviously you can see in this picture, it's a very big city. And I loved being here. This was a beautiful place for me to be. You can see in the picture, gorgeous views. There was very fresh mountain air, green, and obviously so much history, so much meaning. So I love being here, and I kind of imagined myself exploring. If I wasn't in the army, I would want to explore this area and travel and climb the mountains and just enjoy it. And I found myself after after being deployed here, that one of the jobs that I was actually being asked to do while on Har Eval, Mount Eval, was to make sure the Palestinians from the valley in the city of Nablus don't climb up towards the army base. And if they start climbing up the mountain and get closer to the army base, then we were sent down the mountain in an army jeep. And we told them we have to get back. They have to, go back down the mountain. So at that moment, very early on, I found myself preventing basically Palestinians from the city of Nablus of doing something that I felt that I would want to do if I was in their position. And that was, I think, maybe one of the first moments or experiences that I had in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, where I began to feel like, wait, what am I doing here? And I accumulated over the months that I spent deployed in the West Bank and then in the Gaza Strip, many experiences like this, which really kind of posed these kind of big question marks around what I was doing. And ultimately, after my service, I ended up giving testimonies from my service to Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence is one of the most active anti-occupation organizations in Israel, which meets with hundreds of groups every year. On regular years, we're doing hundreds of face-to-face meetings with Israelis and diaspora and international groups. It's an organization, as was mentioned earlier, of IDF veterans who served in the occupied territories. There are testimonies we've collected testimonies from over 1,200 former IDF soldiers who served in the occupied territories since the Second Intifada. So kind of this phenomenon I just described of preventing Palestinians from moving freely through the West Bank is actually, it's not just on Mount Eval. If you actually look across the valley, there's on the other mountain on Har Bracha, there's also a settlement called Har Bracha, which there is a whole area around the settlement where Palestinians aren't allowed to get near. you can actually see here, zoomed in on the right, there's my friend standing, soldier who served with me, standing just overlooking the city. And basically, this is a map of the West Bank. There are around 3 million Palestinians living in the West Bank. There's 2 million in the Gaza Strip. And, these two territories were captured by Israel in the 1967 war from Jordan and from Egypt. And since 1967, there's also been the establishment of hundreds of settlements and outposts scattered really throughout the territory. You can see in this map, the blue are the settlements, and the different colored dots are these unauthorized outposts, which there are around 100 of. These settlements and outposts are inhabited by Israeli citizens. There's over 500,000, in the West Bank, Israeli citizens called settlers who have come to settle this area. And the body that's responsible for ruling over this entire area is ultimately soldiers like I was in the IDF. And basically, around every one of these settlements is this area, which we call the area beyond the red lines, around the settlements where Palestinians aren't allowed to move. And I want to read with you a testimony from a soldier from 2013 from the Nablus area who describes this phenomenon of the red lines. When you see the map of the red lines, your whole concept changes, because the area looks as if it's full of 99% Palestinians with something like 3 small settlements. But when you suddenly look at it, even zooming out at the whole Samaria area, you understand that Palestinians are actually banned from entering a huge chunk of it. They can hang around there. Around every such settlement, there's a circle, a radius of 1 kilometer, a huge area you're not allowed to enter if you're Palestinian. Now, this area is really uncultivated, but I don't know what it would be if Palestinians were allowed to enter it. Now, in this soldier's experience, the areas beyond the red lines were uncultivated, but in one of the settlements that I was stationed at in Kadumim, actually there was much agricultural area that was included in the red lines. There's no fence around Kadumim, but there are cameras that are constantly scanning the area around the settlement. And if a Palestinian gets too close, crosses the red line, around the settlement, then soldiers like me, I was on the rapid response team. In one incident, we get a call on the radio from the civilian operations room of the settlement, who are watching the cameras, and they told us there are 2 Palestinians who, from the village of Kadum, have gotten too close, have crossed the red line. So we put on our combat vests, our helmets, our knee pads. We run into an armored jeep, and we drive as quickly as we can to the area in between the settlement and the village. It's the middle of the day, and it's springtime. We get there within a minute or two. We're already there. We're in these olive groves that are olive trees that are planted in this area, and we run through the olive trees to where we're being directed, and we find a man and a woman in their middle-aged man and woman, maybe in their 50s, and they're both have bags. They're holding bags in their hands, and they're picking leaves off of a bush and filling up the bags with leaves. And we relax a little bit. This doesn't seem to be a security threat at this moment. They're picking leaves, but on the radio they tell us they're not allowed to be there. If they don't leave immediately, you have to arrest them because they're beyond the red lines. And ultimately, my friends and I, we told this couple, if you don't leave right now, we're going to have to arrest you. You're not allowed to be here. And that's what they did. We were standing there, with our full combat gear and our weapons, and they left. They went back towards their village. Now, this is not a phenomenon that is limited to these red lines. There's also a phenomenon called sterile roads, where Palestinians also aren't allowed to travel on. This highway in the picture, Highway 443, which is a road that was declared sterile for many years. Today, it's technically not sterile, but Palestinians really aren't allowed to access or make use of this road. There's also the famous, in Hebron, the famous Shuhada Street, which was the main market place of the city of Hebron. before it was made a sterile road. At first, partially after the Goldstein massacre in 1994, but then permanently and more comprehensively during the Second Intifada, and remains a sterile road today. But also we have testimonies. We have testimony from an officer from Golani, which is another infantry unit, an officer who talks about how during his service there were many sterile roads throughout the West Bank, outside of a village called Salem, also near Nablus. He describes how there was this road that was made to be sterile. Sterile meaning Palestinians aren't allowed to walk on that road or use that road at all. And there were basically shepherds, Palestinian shepherds, who needed to cross the road to get to their grazing land. And they would just be playing this game, he calls it a game of cat and mouse, where the shepherds needed to cross the road, and then they would see them and they would chase after them, and they would throw stun grenades at the shepherds to get them off the road. And this is phenomenon that is really throughout the West Bank. I want to add another layer. Obviously, there are many areas in the West Bank where Palestinians are allowed to travel. Most of the roads and Palestinians do have access to. But on those roads and in those, even in Palestinian villages and cities, IDF in every region has a constant 24/7 has patrols. In most cases, these are armored jeeps like the one you see in the picture here, which we just drive around. And the job is that we're supposed to be seen. People are supposed to see us. And we're supposed to also, be ready to respond to anything that happens. Obviously, always listening to the radio. But we're also in my time on patrols, and also in testimonies from many soldiers that I'll share with you. We also set up what's called a flying checkpoint, or a temporary checkpoint, which looks something a little bit like this. You lay down tire spikes. And you start you pull over to the side of the road. We used to do it on one of the main roads leaving Nablus, connecting to Highway 60, which is one of the main roads in the West Bank. And we would just start stopping vehicles. We would do it for 1 hour out of every 8-hour shift. We would stop depending on who the officer was. They would decide to stop more people or less people. Sometimes there was a traffic jam that was created because we were stopping. Checking people's IDs. We have testimony from soldiers who talk about how they were given quotas. They were told you have to check 100. A soldier who served also in the same area in Nablus, they told him you have to check 100 IDs every day. We have soldiers who talk about setting up these checkpoints at the entrance of a village. A couple of times a week, they would go to the entrance of the village and they would stop every car leaving or entering the village. And they would check their IDs, and sometimes they would do a search of the car. We have a soldier also who talks about that when he did these flying checkpoints, they actually went inside the center of the village, and they would create a huge traffic jam, in these small villages, and they would just start, stopping the cars and checking them. And he, in this testimony, I think in a small village, the soldier describes how the testifier describes how they weren't looking for anyone in particular. And, they had no idea who was coming through the checkpoint. He says that if Ahmad Yassin, the founder of Hamas, would come through a checkpoint, he wouldn't have stopped them. He wouldn't have known. And really the reason that I was told, the orders that I were given, why were we setting up these checkpoints, was to create something called making our presence felt. We were there to kind of show the Palestinians that we're there, show them that we're the boss, that we rule over them, that we can stop traffic at any point. This is a recurring theme in our testimonies. I'll read for you just this excerpt from a soldier from the Nachal 50th Battalion who served 2012 in Hebron. Whenever we go out on a mission, we're told we're here for the Jews. We looked at every Palestinian citizen as a suspect, always. We had to be alert when it was at the crossings, in the guard post, look suspiciously at every one of them. We did a lot of things that really to this day, I believe that if I was on the other side, I don't know if I could have reacted with such restraint in the way that Palestinian population reacts to the army or the Jews there. For example, we had to do once a day or two a patrol in the Palestinian neighborhoods, even if they're as quiet as can be, just to give them the feeling that we control them. Deterrence. See, the army's here. Don't even dare cause trouble. We have soldiers stepping on your toes. When we walk around, enter shops, sort of like look to see that everything's okay, continue on walking, even if nothing problematic was happening. I remember even asking my platoon commander why we're doing what we're doing now. And he says, to demonstrate presence, to show deterrence, to show the Palestinians there's someone ruling over them. Now, there's another layer beyond these checkpoints, these patrols, these, making our presence felt in this way, which I'll share with you, which is called mapping missions. We actually just put out a very, very thorough report called A Life Exposed about the IDF home invasions, together with some partner organizations, Yesh Din and Physicians for Human Rights. And one type of home invasion that the IDF does in the occupied territories is something called a mapping mission. And basically, a mapping mission is IDF soldiers are sent to pick out a house in a neighborhood or a village, and they go into that house. They go there specifically. They chose this house because the people living in this house are what's called unaffiliated or uninvolved with terrorism or anything like that. And the idea is to go into the house and to map it out, to maybe draw a sketch or to take pictures, to ask some questions to the people living in the house. And ostensibly, this is for intelligence purpose, for soldiers to be familiar with the territory. But the reason that comes up in many of the testimonies that we've collected on this type of mission, these mapping missions, for example, Nadav Weiman, our deputy director, who served in the same unit that I did a few years before me, he says that basically they would do these mapping missions on nights when they didn't have any other more important operational missions or arrest missions to do in the occupied territories. They would do these mapping missions for the purpose of also making IDF presence felt, to kind of disrupt the daily life of the Palestinians and to make the IDF presence felt. And we have testimony from a soldier, from an officer who served in the Bethlehem area, who talks about how he, after this second mapping mission, he already realized that all of the pictures and the sketches that they were taking, it wasn't, no one really gave a shit about what happened or about organizing the information in any way, because he realized that the real reason for these mapping missions is creating a certain sense of psychological pressure on the Palestinians. We can come into your house, anyone's house, in the middle of the night. IDF can be here and gather this information. We have testimonies from a soldier who said that he would do mapping missions, that was close to his own houses, that were near his base or that were near settlement. And he realized after doing that, basically, that he was going into the house and mapping out a house that had already been mapped out before, that they had already gone into this house in the middle of the night, as most of these mapping missions take place, and to map out this house. Now, I want to share with you one last testimony from my service. And this testimony that I'm going to share with you also took place in Kfar Kadum, in the village I described earlier. The village, it's just to the east of, it's just to the west of Nablus. And basically this road that I'm tracing, you can see, this road connects the village to the city of Nablus. And obviously this is, the main road of the village. And at some point over the past few decades, as the settlement of Kadumim expanded, the IDF made this road, they turned this road into a sterile road. And they forbid Palestinians from using this road. So at some point, again, years before I arrived at this base, at the settlement, the Palestinians from Kadum started doing a protest march. Every Friday they would march on the road. And the soldiers, we were always sent with like full riot gear with shields and visors to disperse the protest and to prevent the Palestinians from going on the road. And it was always really quite a spectacle. The Palestinians would be burning tires. There was this thick black smoke. And they would be throwing rocks at us. We would be firing tear gas at the protesters, and we also had rubber-coated bullets that we would shoot at the knees or below of sometimes if we would identify a what's called a primary instigator, or Mesith Merkazi in Hebrew, of the protester of the protest. We would shoot. We'd identify and shoot at their legs. And it was always a big drain on manpower. It was always on the weekend, and many of the soldiers were home for the weekend. And basically, at one point, the officers of my unit decided that we were going to do a raid on Kfar Kadum on a Thursday night, the night before the protest, and we were going to arrest over a dozen protesters that they had identified, of teenagers, young men who participated in the protest. And that way we would kind of really take the wind out of the sails of the protest. And it would be a much more calm protest if we arrest, a dozen of the main protesters. So we go in, we identify all the houses, and, arrest missions, we would always go with our full combat gear, and we would put, in addition, masks that cover our whole face, except for our eyes, obviously. And we would go into the house. We would knock on the door, wake up the family, barge into the house. We would separate the family into one room. Try to isolate the young man in this case, or teenager who we wanted to arrest. We would take them, put their hands behind their back, put a blindfold around their eyes, and we would take them, put them in a military jeep, and they would be taken off. Now, in one of the cases, one of the houses that we went into, actually one of the younger brothers of the protester that we were arrested actually started fighting back against my friend, who was punching the soldiers, my friends. And we overcame him very quickly, and we arrested his brother, and we took him out of the house, and we put him in the jeep. I have a picture here, basically a soldier who took one of the Palestinians that he arrested, and the jeep drove off. And as we were leaving the village, the officer told us, go back and arrest the younger brother now, the one who fought back. So we went back and we arrested him, but the jeep had already left. So actually we ended up having to walk him out of the village, and we started walking him back all the way back to our base. And this was actually unusual because usually I didn't spend much time with the people I was arresting, the Palestinians that I was arresting. And in this case, it was it was like a 17-year-old Palestinian kid who was in his pajamas, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, in his slippers, walking in the same olive trees, on the outskirts of the village. And I remember just looking at him and just kind of thinking and reflecting about kind of what led me to this moment where I'm here sitting under an olive tree with a blindfolded and handcuffed Palestinian 17-year-old boy. And what led me to join the IDF, to defend Israel, to protect us from foreign armies, from suicide bombers blowing up buses. And here I was with this 17-year-old Palestinian who I went into his house in the middle of the night to arrest his brother, who was protesting the sterilization of a road, and who fought back against our soldiers and punched our soldiers, and we had to arrest him. But I realized that there was a massive gap between what I envisioned, the IDF defending Israel, and what actually soldiers are doing on a day-to-day basis in order to maintain the occupation. And I began to realize very, very deeply also when I reflected on these events, also in the years after my service even more, that really what we were doing was not we weren't keeping Israelis safe. That's not all we were doing. We were arresting this boy. What kind of threat is he? What kind of threat is he to Israelis, at home at the same time at 2 o'clock in the morning in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Eilat, in Haifa, in Beit Shemesh? This is not simply a story of security, of defending Israel from threats. And ultimately, that's what I think really led me to breaking the silence, because I realized, and I took this picture as well in one of the army bases that I was stationed on. It's a picture of a soldier who, at a protest, is dragging a Palestinian flag through the dirt that he has apparently confiscated at a protest. And I realized that this is really kind of more of an embodiment of what's going on in the occupied territories. We're controlling through military force millions of Palestinians against their will. And that's what led me to break my silence and to share my testimonies, to bring this reality to the Israeli public. Breaking the Silence was founded by a group of soldiers who, like me, served in the occupied territories in Hebron during the Second Intifada, really at the height of the peak of bloodshed and violence, where thousands of Israelis and Palestinians were killed and murdered during the Second Intifada. And they would, be responsible for maintaining control of Hebron. Palestinians were under curfew. There was a very, very intense violence. And they would come home for weekends to their families, and they realized that people really didn't have any clue. No one was talking about what was going on. So they put together this photo exhibit. Towards the end of their service, they started taking pictures, collecting testimonies from each other. And as shortly after they finished their service, they put together this photo exhibit in Tel Aviv. They called it, Breaking the Silence, Bringing Hebron to Tel Aviv. And thousands of people came to this photo exhibit from all across Israeli society. Very influential public figures, journalists, politicians, generals, but most importantly, soldiers from other units who served in other cities and other areas, who began comparing and sharing their experiences. And they realized what the group realized, and they were actually invited to present in the Knesset, and they were speaking, and they were sharing their testimonies. But really what happened when they met the soldiers who served in Ramallah, in Bethlehem, in Jenin, in Gaza, and they started exchanging their experiences, they realized that they were telling a story that was not just about Hebron. It was a systematic story of what the occupation looks like. And that's how they really founded Breaking the Silence, from that exhibit into an organization, which to date has collected testimonies from over 1,200 former IDF soldiers. And all of our work, we engage in very intensive educational work, with hundreds and hundreds of meetings with Israeli pre-military academies, with Israeli university groups, civil society groups of diaspora Jews, international groups. Every year, we take groups on tours. Really, kind of maybe during a normal year is one of our most kind of intensive form of education, is taking groups to see the occupied territory, the occupation for themselves, taking them on tours to Hebron, taking them on tours to the South Hebron Hills, the Area C, Musafariata. And we do this all to show the reality to the public, to stimulate public debate about the moral cost of the occupation, and with the goal of ending the occupation. So thank you again for inviting me to speak and to share this, my personal story and testimonies, and kind of tell you a little bit more about our work. We're obviously, this is a very challenging time with past 4 years with Trump and now the transition. And obviously COVID made it more difficult for us to reach groups, but we're really doing our best to reach groups virtually. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much, Benzi, for that wonderful presentation. Really, that was very, very interesting and informative. And I think, especially for me, being in the ecumenical accompaniment program, in Tulkarem and Kalkilia, we actually participated in the demonstrations in Kafir Kadum, and did see the reality there from the other side. So it's very, very interesting now to get your perspective. And I think one of the things that I found most striking during my time in Palestine was exactly maybe what I feel like you described very well here, this almost mundanity of the occupation, with some of the activities that seem to be almost more centered on kind of, sometimes I would say just petty harassment or something like this. I didn't really see the motivation behind it. And also I think in Kafir Kadum, it's interesting to see how it's turned so formulaic. The soldiers know when the demonstrators turn up, the demonstrators know when the soldiers turn up, and it seems to play out more or less along the same lines the majority of times. And then sometimes you have these big incidents and some people get seriously hurt. And I think it's very interesting to hear about you describe what seems to be almost a sense of disillusionment, maybe. What you said about the gap between vision and reality. And I'm just wondering, because you seem to reflect a lot about this, and is your impression that other soldiers as well, when they're there, think about it, what they're doing, kind of critically assess their role in the occupation, or is it a minority?
Thank you for your question. I think that we've collected testimonies from over 1,200 soldiers. This is obviously a small minority of the soldiers who served in the occupied territories. And to be quite honest, I think most soldiers, and including myself at many points, like what interests you most is kind of getting enough sleep and getting home to see your friends and family. And there isn't a lot of time for so much reflection. Although I know that there are many more soldiers who don't want to be doing this than the 1,200 soldiers in breaking the silence. Obviously, there are obviously many soldiers who maybe feel that this is the best thing for Israel to control the Palestinians. And obviously there are right-wing Israeli parties who are talking openly about getting rid of as many Palestinians as possible, and driving them out of their villages, and certainly in Area C, and maybe even more in Hebron. Many of the settlers who live there are followers of Meir Kahane, who founded a terrorist organization and believed in transferring all the Palestinians out. Again, that's really on the fringes of Israeli society, but these are voices that the party, which represents the followers of Meir Kahane, was welcomed into the coalition by Netanyahu in just in the past years in elections time, and so these voices are receiving more and more mainstream acceptance. And so there are soldiers who see it, there are who don't. I it's hard to give you exact data. That I know that there are. I won't speak for anyone else in my unit. I know that there are soldiers who weren't particularly thrilled to be carrying out these types of missions. And actually one of the other soldiers from my unit is also broke his silence and is giving testimony to breaking the silence. But it's silence is not a uniquely Israeli epidemic, as Yehuda Shaul, our founder, talks about it. But it is a real problem when you live in a society who for 53 years has maintained the occupation. It's not easy to speak out about it, and especially with so much delegitimization of those who speak out against the occupation. It's not an easy thing to do, but there are we're getting constantly collecting testimonies from soldiers. More and more. It's a growing body of testifiers that we have.
And you mentioned it's not easy to speak out. Maybe you could quickly just tell us a little bit about what are the risks of speaking out? Like, what sort of backlash do people who break the silence experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that, I mean, thank God it's not as bad as it has been in the past, but there were times, and there was a very fascist right-wing group who ran a campaign delegitimizing us, you know, comparing us to supporting terrorists, with, like, there was a video of a terrorist stabbing the camera, and then it was like, you know, look at these human rights activists and breaking the silence. Avner Gvaryaw, our director, who you know, he's defending them and he's on their side, and like, there were times where, you know, there was violence, you know, against people were arrested planning to burn down our offices. But you know, today I think there's a lot of social stigma in coming out. I post sometimes. I posted a job offering at Breaking the Silence, and a group of immigrant soldiers like me, it was taken down. The organizers of the group said, "Yo, you can't. You know, this is too controversial." You know, so there is, you know, backlash, and I got messages from people who I studied in yeshiva saying, "I can't believe you did that. You know, I can't believe you're breaking the silence." But really, I have, you know, I found, you know, there is a lot of support also in Israeli society. We recently opened a Friends of organization, which has many leading figures, public figures, cultural figures, also former generals. Even the former head of the Shin Bet, Ami Ayalon, is a member of the organization, of the Friends of Breaking the Silence organization. So we do get a lot of support. You know, we were invited yesterday. Avner Gvaryaw, our director, spoke in the Knesset. You know, we do have some support from the Joint List Party and the Meretz Party, and you know, we're always working to garner more support. But we definitely have a lot of public support, although it is definitely far from the majority. But you know, hopefully, you know, we'll get there.
Thank you. And Pernilla, do you have any questions?
No, but I could take some, I could read out loud some questions from our audience. One question here is, what real effect do you think testimonies have on Israeli society?
You know, it's a good question. I think we really have, you know, people react differently. I think one of the interesting phenomenons that I encounter is that people think, because we're so attacked, we've been attacked by these right-wing groups, and also delegitimized by right-wing ministers in the Israeli government in the past years. People think that we're such a terrible organization who, you know, we're traitors, or, you know, supporting terrorists, and then they actually hear the testimonies and they say, "Oh wow, that's like, oh, I get it. Like, oh, that's not so good," or that's also what I did in my service. But maybe they still disagree with our politics. But ultimately, I think that if you read the testimonies, and we have all our testimonies on our database, and we publish booklets, and we have public testimony readings, these testimonies are all verified and you know, corroborated meticulously. So people ultimately don't have generally much to say about the actual factualness of, you know, are there mapping missions? Of course there are mapping missions. Are soldiers, you know, is the IDF demolishing homes of Palestinians in Area C? Yes, of course they're demolishing homes of Palestinians in Area C. Are, you know, soldiers setting up these flying checkpoints? Yes, of course. These are things that we're describing them because we want people to be talking about them. We want people to be thinking about them. We want people to be asking themselves, is this moral? But, you know, people who think that it is moral, or people who think that we have no other choice and this is security, or people who think that this is all our land, God gave us this land and Palestinians have no right to any self-determination or to have equal citizenship because this is, you know, our God-given land. So they view us as a real threat. And I think that that's why we are so attacked and delegitimized, because we are a threat. We're a threat to, you know, the settlement movement, and the right wing who wants to control, you know, all of the territory, and they want, you know, never to allow Palestinians to have self-determination or equal rights in whatever, you know, solution is proposed. They don't want to end the occupation. So yeah, they react very terribly. I think not so much to just the testimony, but what we're trying to do with the testimony. They'll probably take the same testimony and go, "Good job, you show them." So the actual reality is really, I think there's not so much to be said about it.
Another of our audience, she asks something similar, Adele here, having been an EA as well and experienced situations of which you speak, how were and are you received among your friends and family, having broken your silence?
I think, thank God I have a good, very close relationship with my friends and my family, and I've, a lot of support all around. It definitely hasn't been received smoothly by my family, in some cases. But I think, I think there's a lot of fear, which is justified in some cases about anti-Semitism. That if you speak badly about Israel, then you're helping anti-Semites who just hate Israel because it's a Jewish country. And the fact that anti-Semitism exists cannot allow us to be silent about the occupation, and can't stop us from fighting against the occupation in Israel and abroad. And honestly, I think, or the best thing we can do for anti-Semitism, the worst thing that we can do for ourselves, is to continue the occupation, because the occupation is an immoral act. And of course, if you hate Jews and if you are anti-Semitic, you'll say, "Oh, look what the Jews are doing. The Jews are terrible." You can't just be silent because anti-Semitism exists. And as a matter of fact, I think that working and fighting as Israelis, as I consider myself as an Israeli patriot, I really do. And Avner does, and our, as a movement, we are working because we think ending the occupation is the best thing for Israel. And so that's why we dedicate ourselves to it, and at risk of attack and being delegitimized, that's really what motivates us. So I really think that on the one hand, it's not everyone sees it that way, and if some of my friends and some of my family don't see it that way, but I can only say the way I see things, and hopefully we'll be able to overcome some of the attacks and the delegitimization, and eventually we keep building support for fighting against the occupation.
Thank you. And Connie here says, to follow up, what effect does it have on the Knesset?
We still have a pretty right-wing Knesset. This Knesset with Netanyahu and Gantz, it's not a Knesset that is really doing anything. They're the opposite. They're making the occupation deeper and deeper. They're demolishing more and more homes of Palestinians. They're expanding. An excellent report just came out about infrastructure. That Breaking the Silence just came out about how much Israel has invested into infrastructure and making the settlements permanent and making the occupation permanent. So none of our work has really had any effect on the government. Again, like I said, there are members of Knesset in the opposition in recent years, from Meretz and from the Joint List, which we're pushing, and we're partners with them, and they're helping us, inviting us to speak in the Knesset and to get our message out. But we're not seeing any changes from this current government, and any really legislation to work towards ending the occupation, unfortunately.
Thank you. And our last question is, if we can have access to the database, is it on your website?
Yes, it is. We have tens of thousands of testimonies on our website. Most of them have been translated. We have an English website. Not all of them have been translated. So if you read Hebrew, you can even read more. But I guarantee you, if you stay after the next 6 hours, you still won't finish our testimonies reading. But I do encourage you, follow us also on social media, on Facebook, Instagram. We share a lot of testimonies that are relevant to current events and things that are happening, in addition to special projects that we work on and reports.
Thank you. I would really like that.
Yes, I guess what remains then is thanking everyone who showed up, and thank you so much to you, Benzi, for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it, and all the best of wishes to you and to the further work of Breaking the Silence as well.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and have a great night.
And from us, also West Bank Live, this is our last episode of this year. And like all our other episodes, it will be available on YouTube and Spotify. And we hope that maybe we will be back next year for season 2. So
Okay.
until then, thank you so much.